This is Vanessa Gorman. We're going to talk today about the voice of the Greek verb. If you'll recall, once again, finite verbs have person, number, tense, mood, and voice. By voice, we mean active, middle, or passive. Deponent is the form in which you use a middle form with an active meaning, and we've seen them already. Active is what we've seen. Otherwise, all of the meanings we've seen so far are active. The subject is the agent of the verb. Again, that's an oversimplified definition, but themistically, subject one, predicative, the verb, the battle, object. There's also in Greek something called the middle, in which the subject is still the agent of the verb, but there's some reference back to himself, herself, theirselves. So if Susan exercises in the middle, there's a kind of implication that she's doing it for her own benefit. If Kaimon pours a libation in the middle, it's for his own benefit. If he pours it in the active, it could be for the city or something else. The hoplite prepared for battle, that has that sense of himself in it, and so it will take a middle. Deponents, remember, are just active verbs with middle or passive forms, machomai, erchomai, gignomai, etc. So we've already seen these from the beginning. They shouldn't bother you. However, some verbs change their meaning when they change their voice. So for example, hyreo means to take or seize. But in the middle, if you take it for yourself, you are choosing. Aiteo is to ask. If you're asking for yourself, you're begging. Misthoo is to hire out. But in the middle, it means to rent. So see how there's a little subtle difference there. Krao is to give an oracle. Middle is to consult an oracle. Phino is to cause to appear, but it's much more common in the middle with the word seem. He seemed to be. And so we'll see that in the middle all the time. Now, how do you know how to translate these things? Well, when you have your Alpheus tool open, you go to the long dictionary meaning. And so, for example, patho, which means to persuade. And this is the long dictionary meaning for patho. The beginning of it goes on a little longer. And the first thing you're going to see here are all the different possible forms with references to where they occur once, not always. And then it will give you the most common meanings. So A is the most common meaning. In the active, it means to prevail upon or persuade. Tina, right, is tis in the accusative singular. It means that you accuse someone in the accusative. They'll stick tis in there. Sometimes they'll say with the accusative. Sometimes they'll just use forms of tis, tina. So you persuade someone in the accusative in the active. But what we have here is middle that we're trying to look at. Well, if you keep going down through all the active meanings, which I've cut off, you'll see B, passive and middle. To be prevailed upon, won over, persuaded. It can be used absolutely. So with no object, he was persuaded. So as a monovalent verb. Or, if you keep going down here, he was persuaded by someone in the dative. That is to say, he obeyed him. So you obey someone, tini, in the dative. So in the middle voice, you obey someone in the dative. You can also, if you keep going down to another major meaning, to, you can believe or trust in someone in the dative. And likewise, trust or rely on someone with a dative of the person, vel re, meaning or the thing. So you can rely on something or someone. So you have to explore the lexicon entries to figure out what's going on. If you see this word and you see it's in the middle, you want to look and see what the middle is rendered as, because sometimes it's going to have a significantly different meaning. Now, passive is something you see a lot in English and often misuse. Essentially, what had been the direct object becomes the subject, and what had been the subject becomes an agent, usually expressed in Greek by hupo plus the genitive, by X. That is labeled as an object because it's a necessary argument. The instrument or thing, however, if it's not a person, it's usually an adverb, right? Dative of means, dative of instrument. So, for example, in the active sentence, Themistocles subject killed him, object, with a club, adverb. If you make this passive, he was killed by Themistocles, the object becomes the subject becomes the agent, which is labeled as an object. If he was killed with a club, the club remains an adverb. And we know that because you can have all of these together. And so he was killed by Themistocles with a club would look like that. All right. So that's kind of how to render them. In the present and perfect stems, the same form represents both the middle and passive. So it's called the mediopassive or just MP. And you have to decide from context whether to render it as middle or passive, or if there really is even much of a difference. If there's a hupo and a genitive, you know it's an agent and therefore must be a passive by someone. Aorists and futures do have different forms, but the futures, again, not going to be seen very often. The common forms in Greek are the aorist active, middle and passive, the imperfect active, and then middle passive, and the present active, middle passive. We've already learned two of these at great length, the aorist active and the imperfect active. So what we're going to see are these 5 combinations of tenses and voices are the most common forms of the verb in Greek. Much less common are the perfect active, middle passive, the future active, and middle. And we're not even going to talk about the pluperfect and future perfect because they're so uncommon. So the deponent, middle, and mediopassive of third-person endings, we've already seen tie and entie, toe and ento. The aorist passive, notice, the sign of the aorist passive is a theta. So the and theson. And that's so obvious that you can spot it a mile away. So here's the trick. Sigma is the sign of the future imperfect and aorist. First aorists. Kappa is the sign of the perfect, and theta is the sign of the aorist passive. Okay, so if you see a theta sitting there, it's probably going to be an aorist passive, especially followed by an eta. Now, you can stop there and not worry about what they all look like and jump to the chart at the very end of this presentation. But it's better if you listen through the rest just to see what's going on. So just to get a fuzzy idea in your head how we're forming these things. The present is the same as the present deponent ending. So you just take the first principal part and add etai and ontai. So pempse, he sends. Pempetai, he is sent. Or he sends for his own sake. And this is all you do. So etai, ontai on the present stem. Sorry, there should be an poietai in there, so that's misspelled. The imperfect just uses the secondary endings. So again, you have the augment. Again, you work off the first principal part, but instead of and on, you have eto and onto. So it looks like the active, except it's got the toe on the ends of them. So that's pretty easy too. The aorist middle. Sorry, I've got all of these here. Again, has the augment, has a sigma as the sign of the aorist if it's the first aorist, or it just has the eto onto if it's the second aorist. So again, ato, onto, ato, onto, eto, onto. If it's got the aorist stem, you're going to see that it's the middle or passive. The aorist passive is easy to spot a mile away. It has the augment, it has the stem from the last principal part, and it has these thetas in it. So aorist passives are really easy to spot. Epemphe, epemptheson. You see that, and again, you see it a mile away, and the only question is, what's the lemma? What do you look it up under? And in this day and age, you let the computer do your work for you. He has been sent. They have been sent, or they were sent, you could say. see the same thing. They, son. They're so easy to spot, it's not funny. Perfects, it's not even really worth going into this. Remember, the sign of the perfect active is a reduplication and a kappa. Well, the perfect middle passive, there we go, is the reduplication and then the tie, and these are formed off the fifth principal part. Again, that's the only reason you have the fifth principal part, is to know how to form this. But you're not forming it, you're just seeing it. And so when you see that reduplication, you'll say perfect, you'll see the passive, mediopassive endings, and you'll say, aha, I know what it is. So in sum, we have these distinctive endings in the third person singular and plural. We have different endings in the aorist passive only, and they're very, very conspicuous by their theta. You see the sigma, you see the kappa, you see the theta as the signs of the different tenses. Now, if you don't care about all that, just to help keep things straight, I've pulled out some sample verbs that have different patterns, different kind of paradigms to them, so you can see what are typical looking aorists and what are typical looking present active, present middle passive, imperfect active, imperfect middle passive. So these are just sort of typical words. So I've given you thuo, which is very regular. I've given you pempo, which has epempsa, so we contract here and we get a different stem later. Feugo goes to efugon, so you have a second aorist. Balo, again, is the second aorist where it changes the stem. Poieo gives you a contract verb. Erchomai gives you a deponent, and histemi gives you a me verb. So you can see kind of typical paradigms, and sometimes they simply don't have these parts. You can't be fled. So there's no aorist of flee. It just doesn't make sense. Some verbs are like that. You can't become. Erchomai, to come or arrive at. There's no middle or passive to it. Sometimes just the forms never occur, or there's something else going on. But this is a nice chart to keep for yourself. I've given it to you as a handout so you can see what are the typical forms if you're wondering.